Most teachers start planning a unit by asking, what should students know by the end of this? It's a reasonable question, but there's a better one. And when I changed it, it didn't just change my assessments, it changed how I planned the entire unit.
Welcome to the Secondary Teacher Podcast, the podcast for middle and high school teachers juggling multiple preps to get the strategies to reduce overwhelm so that you don't have to choose between being an effective teacher and prioritizing important relationships. I'm your host, Khristen Massic, a 10-year high school engineering teacher, former middle school assistant principal, and teacher coach. Every week, we will discuss strategies, systems, and time-saving tips to help you not only survive but thrive as a multiple prep teacher.
This is the final episode in our series on the Introduce, Practice, Produce framework. We've talked about creating a need to know in the introduction phase. We've talked about designing practice that gives students feedback while they're still learning. Today, we're closing out with the produce phase, and I want to start with the moment I got stuck. Inside the unit planning lab, I've been building a 3D printing unit live, planning in real time with the group, leaving visible notes so participants can see the thinking behind every decision. And when I got to the produce phase, I hit a wall. My first instinct was to make a list. Not only what should my students know when they finish this unit, but what should they know when they finish this class? Slicer settings, orientation and how it affects its strength, infill, printer maintenance, materials, safety protocols, all important, all in the standards, but something felt off because I kept looking at that list thinking, none of these are actually my goal. Knowing what infill isn't the point. Being able to recite slicer settings isn't the point. So I stepped back and asked a different question. What decisions do I want students to be able to make without me? And everything got clear. Because when students leave my classroom, I'm not standing next to every printer they'll ever use. I want them to look at a project, think through what that print needs to do, and make good decisions on their own. Should this be lightweight or durable? Does the orientation matter for this specific use? Do I need supports? Is the extra material worth it if the final product is stronger? Those are professional decisions. That's what I actually want students to leave my classroom able to do. Not recite, not recall, decide. So here's the shift. Instead of asking, how can students prove they've learned this? Ask, what would convince me they're ready to work independently, ready to transfer what they've learned into a situation they've never seen before, ready to make good decisions without waiting to be told what to do. Because ultimately, that's what we're building toward, not students who can perform on command. Students who have developed the judgment to act on their own. And that's a different thing to design an assessment around. Here's what surprised me about asking that question first. Once I knew the kinds of decisions I wanted students making at the end of the unit, planning everything else became easier. I knew what belonged in the introduction. Students needed experiences that would help them notice why those decisions mattered before I ever explained the mechanics behind them. I knew what belonged in practice. Students needed opportunities to test ideas, compare results, make mistakes, receive feedback, and adjust. Not to perform, to develop judgment. Every phase of the unit was suddenly pointing toward the same thing, that final moment when students had to make a decision on their own. Not because I'd told them the answer, because they'd built the understanding to choose it themselves. When you design the produce phase first, or at least think about it first, the rest of the unit organizes itself around it. That's backward design. And it works. Here's the part of assessment most planning conversations skip. Assessments don't just tell you how students performed. They tell you something about your instruction. If every student struggles with the same decision, maybe the practice phase didn't provide enough feedback opportunities. Maybe the introduction didn't build the right curiosity. Maybe there was a misconception that should have been surfaced earlier and wasn't. Assessment becomes a mirror, not just for students, for you. And that's why I think about it as assessment for learning, not just assessment of learning. Because when you look at a set of student work and ask, what does this tell me about what I need to teach differently next time? You've turned your assessment into one of the most powerful planning tools you have. That next time you teach this unit will be better. not because you worked harder, because your students' work told you exactly what to fix. Before you ever build an assessment, ask yourself this: what decisions do I want students to be able to make independently by the end of this unit? Not what facts should they memorize, not what vocabulary should they know. What should they be able to decide confidently, independently, without you in the room? Because once you can answer that question clearly, the introduce phase writes itself, the practice phase writes itself, and the assessment stops feeling like something you bolt on at the end and starts feeling like the thing the whole unit was always building toward. One question I've gotten about the unit planning lab is why we only focus on one unit. Why not plan the whole course? Because I've tried to plan the whole course in a summer and it didn't work. By October, half of what I built didn't fit anymore because I hadn't taught it yet. I was planning for a version of my classroom that hadn't happened. So in the lab, we plan one unit, but we plan it really well. We think through the introduce phase intentionally. We design practice that actually builds understanding. We define what independent decision-making looks like before we build the assessment. And then, because the thinking is explicit and visible, you can repeat the process for every unit that comes after. The goal isn't to leave the lab with an entire year's worth of plans. The goal is to leave with a planning process you'll use for years. That's a very different outcome, and honestly, a much more valuable one. Over these 4 episodes, we've talked through the Introduce, Practice, Produce framework one phase at a time. Not because teachers need another framework, but because I think teachers deserve a planning process that reduces decision fatigue instead of adding to it. When you know what your introduction is supposed to do, create a need to know, not just entertain, you stop wasting time on hooks that don't lead anywhere. When you know what practice is supposed to do, build understanding through feedback, not collect grades, you stop drowning in assignments that don't tell you anything useful. And when you know what your assessment is supposed to do, reveal whether students can make independent decisions, not just recall information, you stop designing units backward from a rubric and start designing them forward from a real learning outcome. That's what intentional planning looks like. And it's available to every teacher willing to ask better questions before they open a blank document. If you've been following this series, grab the free secondary teacher planning calendar in the show notes. It's the same planning tool I use to map out units before I ever start building individual lessons. It'll help you think through your own introduce, practice, and produce phases without feeling like you have to plan everything at once. And if you've been listening to these 4 episodes thinking, I wish someone could help me think through my actual unit like this, that's exactly what the unit planning lab is for. It's not about planning an entire course. It's about working through one unit together, getting feedback, asking better questions, and building a planning process that you can repeat long after the lab is over. The August cohort is opening soon. Join the waitlist in the show notes now for early access and first details when the registration opens. Before you go, one question to sit with this week. When your students leave your classroom, what decisions do you want them to be able to make without you? Because I have a feeling your answer to that question might change the way you plan your next unit. And that's a pretty good place to end this series. Finish something that makes tomorrow lighter. I'll see you next time.